front panels, we will now be taking the back panel and we will be gathering, putting in gathering stitches between our marks or notches. So you would have marked this when you traced and cut out your pattern pieces. You'll need to make sure you put in a long stitch length with a loose tension. You may need to do 2 rows with the poplin. I find 1 is enough. Make sure you do a stay stitch at the beginning. Again, you can see that just by putting in that gathering stitch, it's already started to gather itself along that back piece. And then next we will need to get our back yoke piece, and we will need to line up our centres and then pull our gathers to match the width of that back yoke piece. Okay, now I've pinned my back yoke to my back piece. Now, as it is a curved panel, you just need to be careful to keep that shape. So sometimes the fabric will need to be manipulated a little to fit nicely. And like the front panels, make sure there is overhang, so you have 1/2 inch seam allowance, so you join nicely up when you sew that 1/2 inch seam allowance. Otherwise you'll find you will be short if you match corner to corner. So make sure you change your tension and your stitch length from the gathering. And keep that 1/2 inch seam allowance and stay stitch at the start. Now take extra care when you get to that centre of your back yoke panel to follow that curve, and I've just lifted my presser foot there just so I make sure that I keep that nice little curve. And stay stitch again once you reach the end. So there we have it, and just like the front panel, we're going to do a flat felled seam here also. And just like our front flat felled seam, the back is exactly the same. We just need to remove those gathering threads, which I've already done along there. And then again, I have trimmed the seam allowance from the back yoke piece only. I've trimmed it in half along here. It is very important that you do not trim the bottom seam allowance, so that bottom back panel. Do not trim that seam allowance, as it is very important for constructing that flat felled seam. So I'm just going to press the seam up. From the front, and if all's gone to plan, you should have a little curve along that back yoke and back panel piece. And now we're just going to tuck these that bottom seam allowance over our yoke seam allowance there, and I'm just going to pin as I go and then press. So we'll just fold over. Everything is nice and neat tucked in. And I'll go right the way around. So the pinning is now complete. So I've completely tucked our seam allowance over top of our yoke seam allowance. So all those raw edges are now enclosed. I'm just going to gently press the seam again. And then we will be stitching from the wrong side, nice and close to that the top of our flat felled seam internally here. So we just stitch along that top of our flat felled seam. And I didn't mention earlier, but as it is a stitch that will be exposed on the correct side, sometimes it's nice to use a longer stitch length. Just gives a more professional finish, so I've just increased my stitch length for this stitching. And now complete. And I recommend just giving it one last press before we go on to our next step. Our next step is to prepare the front placket. This is where your buttons and little snaps will be applied at the end. You should have 4 pieces. Now 2 will be the external, 2 will be the internal. You'll need to put aside your non-interfaced pair just for now, as we'll be working with our interfaced pair, which you should have applied your interfacing when you were cutting your fabric. If you haven't, do apply your interfacing now. Don't forget to turn the steam off your iron if you're applying your interfacing. Now, at this step, we will need to press our 1/2 inch seam allowance over on our front placket, and we will be pressing over the long edge, so the edge that is longest. So you can see there's a point at one end here. That is our longest edge. The other edge up here is our short edge. So the edge with the point is the one we will be pressing, and we'll be pressing our 1/2 inch seam allowance over. And we will do this with both of our interfaced placket pieces, and they should be an opposite pair. If they're identical, you've accidentally interfaced a wrong piece. Okay, so I've pressed, and just repeat with your second interfaced piece there, and again make sure it's along that long edge. Our next step is to get our placket pieces and place them right side facing. Make sure you've got the correct pair together, so 1 interfaced placket with 1 non-interfaced placket. You can open it up and you can see that they're the matching pair. So you just pin along the short edge this time, not the long edge, the short edge. And we'll just need to sew that seam at the 1/2 inch seam allowance. Use as many or as little pins as you need, keeping to our 1/2 inch seam allowance. We now stitch down our short edge of our placket, short long edge I should say. Once stitched, just repeat for the other placket, and we will need to press our seam allowance towards the non-interfaced placket piece. So the non-interfaced. Our interfaced placket piece will be the external side of the blouse. So we want to make sure our little seam is tucked away on the inside of our blouse. I'll also add in here, before you press that seam allowance, do just reduce the bulk here, so perhaps cut in half before you press. Once you've sewn and pressed your front plackets, we will now be applying it to our front blouse pieces. Now just take your front plackets and take your front blouse pieces. The interfaced side will be the correct side of your blouse, so just align them with your front blouse piece, and you can see the curve, and you will notice which piece is the correct piece for your blouse. So the straight end is at the bottom and the curved end is at the top. And now what we will need to do is we will take our front blouse piece and take our front placket piece, and we will pin our front placket piece so the right side of the non-interfaced placket piece is against the edge of the wrong side of the blouse. And I know this sounds complicated, but it is important that we do it correctly, otherwise we will have a misshapen blouse. So we'll just pin and sew this edge down. Okay. And use as many or as little pins as you think you need. And just make sure that interfaced piece of placket is well out of the way, as we don't want to stitch down that piece quite yet. Just making sure it all fits along the edge nicely. Just nicely along the curve, as we'll trim off any stray bits at the end. Using the 1/2 inch seam allowance, we'll now stitch our first front placket down. Just remember to stay stitch at the beginning and end of each seam you sew. And so I know it looks a little bit strange from the wrong side, but once we turn the blouse over, you'll see we press that seam allowance in, and then our placket just folds right over top. Once you've sewn your front placket to your front blouse piece, then just press that seam allowance that you've just sewn towards the outside edge of the front of the blouse, and then fold your interfaced placket, top placket over. And if you've got your seam allowances correct, the placket will cover over that stitching you've just done nicely. Our next step is to sew down our front placket from the right side of the blouse down. Now I'll be using an increased stitch length, as this is a visible stitch and it's nice to use an increased length, and we'll just stitch down approximately 1/8 of an inch from the edge. Start off with your stay stitch. this step, if you feel you need to, pin down the placket. I find if you press really well, you can avoid using pins, but please feel free to pin down the placket when you're sewing. And now we will also put another top stitch in, 1/8 of the inch away from the very edge of the blouse. And if you have a little tail here, a little bit of leftover from where we stitched our front placket on, you can just snip that off now, so the curve follows right around. And just repeat these steps. Next, we're going to sew our shoulder seams. So we just need to place our front blouse, one of our front blouse pieces to our back blouse piece. We are going to pin at the shoulders. We'll just do it one at a time. And we're going to do a French seam here. Now, if you are doing the overlocked or serged version, you'll just serge as per the instructions, but I'm showing you the French seam here, and we will do exactly the same for both the left and right shoulder. So we're going to keep to 1/4 of an inch seam allowance here for the French seam. And we now need to trim our seam allowance in half. And I'm just going to press this seam. Now I know it seems odd that we have put the wrong sides together of our blouse, but this is the correct way to do a French seam, so make sure your wrong sides are the facing side for this first step. Now I've just pressed my shoulder seam, and you'll see right sides are now facing together, and we'll do the second part of our French seam on our first shoulder. And again, using the 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, we are now going to stitch with the wrong side of the garment facing towards us. And now we've finished our first French seam on our shoulder. It's lovely on the outside and the inside.